So I wanted to ask you, what impact or what do you believe the emotional climate is in organizations at the moment, and what impact is it having on the workplace?
One of the things that I think is happening, and it's everything from the data that I'm seeing, but also the conversations that I'm having, which is like the best set of data, is that the social contract is shifting. I think it's just, in coaching, we sort of talk about these like sensitive periods and states of disequilibrium. And to me, there's a lot of that happening. And for people who are working in organizations, it's just this question of like, does parity exist? And often it doesn't feel like it does. And so what are the various ways we have to readjust that? And so I think in some cases that's, I'm going to shift my focus more towards my family, my personal life, my own self-care. Some people are shifting into other work structures, and that could look like entrepreneurship or sort of gig work, things like that. And others are just like taking a different look at what they're doing in their current employment. There's all these articles and everything about quiet quitting and, things like that, where it's like folks are just really trying to reconcile with like, how do I do this sustainably over time, given I'm kind of starting with not a full tank.
What to you is the direct connection between happy, engaged employees? What does the evidence say? How does that connect to organizational results?
I think there's like a lot of metaphors that we see. So a lot of our research shows that even when people start with a goal that is very much more like traditional leadership or performance focused, once they get into a coaching engagement, the conversation goes to well-being. And a lot of that is around like, what does the energy tank look like? It's the old adage, like you have to put on your own oxygen mask before you can help those around you, or like you can't pour from an empty cup. And so I think it's twofold. One is that, if you're in a state of survival, or if you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, like in a state of exhaustion, it's just hard to generate the energy, focus, prioritization, and all of that to get work done. But in addition, I think even extending beyond yourself, are you in a state of fear and protection and narrowing off, or do you feel safe and open and, innovative, creative, can take on new challenges? So we see it in a number of ways. And so we do a lot of research on individual level variables and constructs and what's happening in coaching, but we also look at the culture surrounding individuals. And a lot of our research now has been looking at the construct of coaching culture. So really the extent to which people are in a learning environment. Are they asking questions, being curious, providing feedback on an ongoing basis? The systems, processes support that. And it's happening not just with your manager, but also with peers and things like that. So it's not just about the happiness at the individual level, but it's like, is the whole system healthy?
Did you find any surprises as to what some of the factors are linking the coaching culture to those organizational results that you mentioned?
For us, the coaching culture, like we define it in 4 ways, as I mentioned. It's like the managers, the peers, the organizational systems and practices, and then psychological safety. When environments have those characteristics, they're high and like learning oriented, individual growth is higher. It feels like, okay, if I just do the right thing, if I put in the work, like I can continue to grow and develop. And all of that is true. And we're sort of constrained or enhanced by the environment that we're in.
It's really, when you're talking to the financial directors of the world, it's always the HR directors that get it and the connection, the importance of investing in people. But it's the financial directors of the company that want to know, what's the business case? What's the evidence? How am I going to measure this? What are some of the the models that you're finding that would help organizations to really look at this and say, well, here's the business case, and here's how you need to measure this in your organization to really demonstrate within your own organization what that return on investment is?
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why, for me, I was so attracted to the use of technology in coaching. So I began my career really on the measurement side of things and in high stakes testing and things like that. And so when I came into BetterUp in 2016, the exciting thing was that it gave us a way to say, okay, we can use a common set of measures, which is always helpful in understanding what's happening. And we can start to collect outcome data on our own, but also then build integrations to connect to systems of record that organizations are using. What are the metrics that they're tracking and they care about, things like revenue and things like that. And so now we're at the point where a lot of technology platforms are able to tap into those kinds of data and actually do studies to say, okay, if I have a group that gets coached and doesn't get coached, what's the impact? And we can look and see, individuals who are receiving coaching are promoted at higher rates. They have higher performance ratings, better retention, and so these are all things that you can translate then into dollar terms that the CFO cares about. But then beyond that, for me, the even more exciting part is being able to explain why. And that's where those standardized assessments come into place. So, for BetterUp, we use a proprietary assessment called the whole person assessment, and it looks at mindsets. So things like self-awareness, self-efficacy, locus of control, growth mindset, behaviors. So this is everything from how am I taking care of myself to be able to thrive as an individual? But then, once I'm thriving, how do I then inspire others through more traditional leadership behaviors and then this range of outcomes? So when you do that, you can take those outcomes and say, of all these things we measure, in our case, 30 different things, what are the strongest relationships or drivers of those outcomes? And that's where we are able to say things like, okay, if you want to get innovation, you have to have a psychologically safe culture. You have to have someone who feels a sense of self-efficacy. They're engaging in behaviors around inclusion and belonging and things like that. And what that allows people to do is then tailor their approach and coaches to say, okay, if they're trying to achieve this, what do I actually need to work with my client on?
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the different kinds of coaching and, would there be different types of coaching that would be applied in different scenarios of an organization where perhaps it's identified certain factors that are contributing to lower than required performance? Tell us a bit more about that. Yeah.
So yes, and actually we just lost David Peterson this week, unfortunately, who is I think he technically wrote the first dissertation on coaching in the field. And so huge contributions, but I usually adapt some of his models or taxonomies for how to think about coaching. And my personal perspective on it is there's a whole range of coaching, and it's not one or the other. So one of the things we talk about a lot these days is manager as coach. And we get a lot of questions. I'd be curious if you get these too, Louise, about well, is there any concern that if you hire an external coach, that gets the manager off the hook, or there becomes confusion about what their responsibilities are to provide coaching and feedback to their employees? But I think of it as a developmental ecosystem. How do we get to the point where we can fit the intervention to the need? And so, we talk about managers coach, we talk about professional coaching where, and whether it's a specialist coach or a more generalist coach, a developmental coach. And then there's these other things like mentorship, peer coaching. It's just a range of helping behaviors. And how do we get to the point where we can really help people have this suite of options that surround them to help them be their best selves.
Organizations that haven't even started to think, what are the first steps in the transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally what I find is where it starts, and this is, I think, a true characterization of the origins of the industry as well, is it usually starts either at executive ranks, people with very complex jobs that often have to be much more conscious of what they're saying to whom. It can affect stock prices and things like that, right? So executives and or specific cases, and unfortunately often in a case where somebody has some performance challenges or issues, and we're applying coaching as a sort of a one-off or ad hoc intervention. And that's great. It's a way to get started. It's a way to start to see the value of this as an intervention. Perfect. In the next phase, though, I think there tends to be this sense of okay, it's happening in pockets, it's happening in these one-off use cases. How do we start to bring that together and centralize it a little bit so that we can wrap our arms around it, better understand what's happening, and then even use it for a more targeted use case? A common one here is something like a high potential program. Often then you start to get a little bit more sophistication around things like, okay, let's get some criteria on what kind of characteristics of a coach we want to allow into our organization. What does that intake process look like? Maybe we start evaluating at the end, things like that. And then often the way we see it goes next is we're like, okay, we're seeing positive results there. What else can we do with that? And how do we start to use this as more of an intentional tool to drive some of our initiatives and interests in the organization, and or to build capacity more systemically? So there you often see it attached to leadership development programs as an example, where it's all frontline supervisors or people in transition from senior director to VP. And because you're investing more broadly, you start to get more serious about measurement as well. How do we start to track the impact of these engagements, and at a minimum, just know how's it going? Are people happy with it? How can we tool? Then where I see is broader use. So starting to think again, cases where it's all managers in an organization, or all members of employee resource groups. And that's great. It's still focused on group membership. And I don't know about you, Louise, but me, I belong to a lot of groups at the same time. And there's times in my life where, it might be a really heavy period, and no matter how much I want to keep growing, it's not a great time for me to invest a lot of time into a one-to-one intensive intervention. And so how do we recognize that, yes, I'm at a VP level, but I also have 3 children, and maybe I just moved, and maybe I'm an expatriate, and how do we start to take the individual lens on this? And that's where we're seeing really progressive companies switch from this idea of just group membership as how we decide to use coaching, to how do we really start to have a platform that goes to everybody with more data to inform when is it the right time, when can they benefit most from that kind of intervention. So we call that in the maturity model adaptive, and that's where things like these data integrations and things like that, how do you know when somebody's ready to go on maternity leave, and hey, it would be great to have a coach to help them with this without going through some really labor intensive manual nomination process or something like that.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, because you also talk a bit about this shift in a coaching culture, and you talk about processes in an organization that are perhaps in conflict with the shift.
Mm-hmm.
And, you mentioned KPIs or certain ways of doing KPIs, and it's almost moving from the traditional business school way of running an organization and making a complete paradigm shift to operating differently. And that, it's a little bit of a complete mindset change. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what some of those processes are that you see are in conflict with building a coaching culture, and how then do organizations make the shift from traditional ways of doing things to more of a perhaps safer coaching mindset way of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll speak about the one that I think is that everybody loves to hate. So I'll talk about performance management.
Of course, it's
right. This is one of these cases where, I'm not sure even still that like I've ever talked to, maybe I've talked to one or two people who are like, I love my performance management system, but in all the flavors and varieties, like most people hate it. And, there's this question of like, all right, is this lift or drag on performance and the individuals in the system? If we go through all of this and at the end of it, everybody feels worse than they did before they started, or at least, everyone who wasn't told that they were
amazing,
amazing, fantastic. So yeah. I think this is a case where, a lot of these systems are sort of designed with the thought of like, we have these expectations. We're coming in. I am here to give you feedback and tell you how you're performing. And then I'm going to attach a number to it. And it's sort of like this, it's almost got this feel of like protection of the organization. And like, I am here to shape you. If we instead think like, okay, for coaching, the base assumption is that the other individual is creative, resourceful, and whole, and inherently interested in being the best version of themselves, right? Like that just by itself shifts from like performance management as like a control mechanism. And, how do I help you? I keep you on track. I monitor, whatever, to like, how do we co-create this environment in a way that we are partnering to get the best outcome? And where we got from that starting point is like, hey, well, we can make it take less time by ripping out a lot of like the documentation and, all of that, which is great. And that ended up including ratings. But as we started trying to take that journey, we realized like that only works in an environment where people trust each other. It only works in an environment where people actually feel like they're getting the clarity and support and, are they getting the resources they need or whatever. And so very quickly, like the problem space shifted from like changing an administrative program to building a culture and skills and capacity to show up more coach-like, honestly, shifting into a developmentally oriented culture.
And I'm curious as you're talking about it, because it is, I find it really fascinating to make that shift, because I've been grappling with it myself and how to find the right balance, because we all know, organizations live and die by having the right people in the right seats, doing the right things. And sometimes there are just people in the wrong places. They may be not a good fit for the organization, or the role's not right for them. Is there ever the scenario where organizations have just adopted this coaching culture that actually they swing too much to the other side, that maybe accountability drops? I don't know. Is that possible? What have you noticed?
Yeah, I've definitely seen organizations where like the culture has gotten too nice, so to speak. And the pendulum ends up swinging between like, okay, we've gone too much that direction. How do you bring it back towards accountability? But I think my experience has been, and, feel free to challenge me if yours has been different, but I do think that there is a both and here, right? Like there's a way to hold people accountable in a very supportive, nurturing, developmentally oriented way. And I think your point on just like people being in the wrong seats and things is such a great one, Louise. And that's another thing that I think is like ripe for disruption is, there's a lot of vendors out there now really trying to build these talent intelligence, talent marketplace platforms so that you can move people around more easily. Because that's something that historically has not been easy to do. Like, do we know, is somebody not performing because they're not trying or they don't have the skills or whatever? Or is it like a fit issue? And how do we help get them to a better place? So I think in all of these cases, like the world is just, it's really starting to open up in a way where I think coaching is not only like a more useful skill and lens, but coaches are going to have a lot more tools to help them optimize, the potential of people and organizations.
On these two spectrums of organizations that have shifted to more of a coaching culture, in your experience, whether you've come across maybe two different examples of organization where they've really succeeded, and perhaps on the opposite spectrum, an organization that just hasn't got it right in making the shift. And what do you see are the factors that contribute to those two scenarios?
It is legitimately hard. Like we can look at the research, and especially in hindsight, and say that, okay, organizations that do layoffs actually, have long-term negative effects, or, that we know cognitively that organizations that invest in R&D in down times end up doing better in the long run and things like that. At the end of the day, you're still managing a balance sheet. And it's like, okay, well, I've got to make cuts and I don't have great choices. So what am I going to do? And so it is a real challenge. And I don't want to pretend this stuff is easy, but.
Okay, would love to hear how you think the emergent AI, AGI capabilities could enable in fueling this coaching shift.
I think what AI is really powerful for, or any technology, is things like pattern recognition, right? And pattern recognition, efficiency, like things like that. So one of the things that I think it can do is it can help coaches be more effective and efficient. Very simple example, like we saw in our data that when a coach assigned homework between sessions, an article, and reflective exercise, something like that, individual members or coachees grew more, right? They were more engaged in coaching and they grew more. So what we found though is that coaches weren't assigning resources every time, or, this happens to all of us. And it's really hard for an individual to have the perfect resource for every situation, for every client and things like that. So we're able to incorporate AI to just make a recommendation to the coach, like, hey, like, here's a resource that might be useful because they're coding at a very high level. Like, what's the topic? Maybe career conversation or something like that. And the coach can say, like, yes, I want to assign that or not. Like, that alone had huge spikes in the rate at which coaches are making these assignments. Coaches have incredible cognitive load during all of this, right? You can spend the first, 15, 20 minutes, sometimes the whole session, getting clear on like, what is the issue that we want to dive into. So if you can get some of that pre-work done, like that can make the time you have together synchronously, like a lot more powerful. I personally am not in the camp where I see, at least in the foreseeable future, AI replacing coaching, but I do think it's going to be a great tool to increase the impact of human coaching and to extend access to much broader populations.